Okay, so the first thing I wanted to do then was just make sure we have a clear picture of some of the main things we're trying to shoot for this particular project. I think they've given us a wish list of things that they wanted, which I forwarded to you all. And so what I wanted to do was to scope that down a little bit to make sure that it's something that we can manage within the constraints of this particular semester. So make sure that's something that's a little bit more manageable. And so I included certain elements of the list that they provided. Obviously, there are others that they included that I have not listed here. For example, they wanted some suggestions for improvements on the administrative side of things, which is a little bit more amorphous. And so I think it would require a little bit more sort of back and forth to identify what those needs are. And could end up with some additional scope creep as far as the project. So I've tried to restrict that and focus on the ones where there's perhaps a little bit more clarity in terms of what they actually need or looking for. Okay. So clearly, as they mentioned, and I think they reiterated this multiple times, their top priority is to manage this volunteer hours. So recording these and enabling users to input this information on their own on their volunteer service hours. So that's core priority with what we're going to try to accomplish for this particular project. Some other things that are important stipulation for them. One, that it should be accessible on any computer, so that anybody should be able to access the system either through a Windows-based system or through any other operating system. And ideally would be browser independent as well. So you should be able to access it from any kind of browser. So that's very important. And so as we go about actually defining what the architecture is going to look like, it's going to be an important aspect of this as well. And then implement accessibility restrictions. I'd argue that some of that will probably relate to this topic over here, as far as who gets to, I mean, some of these things you'll uncover as you go back and forth with Jan as the primary contact in this project. As far as who gets to change, alter service hours later on, who has accessibility, what's the visibility that volunteer might have into other people's details or accounts versus administrators' use and things like that. So some of this accessibility stuff will probably relate. But independent of that, they also want certain areas of information on the sites to have accessibility restrictions as well, so that for example, members or perhaps members of the executive committee might have access to financials, whereas others may not. Who gets to update and alter that information, things like that. So another key one. And then another important one is this calendar functionality, which we're going to need to get going. Right. So they have a variety of events. They want to be able to post information on those events on a calendar so that users and/or members can go and click on the calendar and then have it pop up further details on a specific event or program. So I want to make sure we have some functionality for that. And then the last one, as far as the big stuff, at least, is making this blog of theirs operational. So I think we currently have a link on there, but it doesn't really do a whole lot at this point. These are just sort of listed these because they're things I definitely wanted, but they're not necessarily functionalities or tasks. So things that essentially just go on the website. I'm going to have just put a tagline in there, just put a new logo on the site. It's not really a functionality, but it is a requirement that they have. That's what they want with the new site. So are there any questions about any of this? One update, because I know this came up a couple of times, and that's with respect to whether or not to coordinate with the existing system versus essentially designing something from scratch. Their preference is to design something from scratch because, as you can see from the second bullet point over here, they want something that's browser independent. And obviously, as they mentioned in the presentation last week, the current system only works as far as updating, only works through IE. So don't be beholden to anything that's currently in place as far as the existing system. We're just going to design this stuff from scratch. Okay, so hopefully that helps give you a better picture of the parameters with which you're operating. One other thing I wanted to mention before we start talking about some of the details of how we're going to manage this project is I know this is an idea that Brandon had brought up, and that's in order to just manage the sharing of information, it would be useful to have just a single site where the communications like specific documentation or insights that one or another of you might get from interactions with Jan or anyone else with the master gardeners would be helpful. So one idea is to do a Facebook kind of page where we have a group set up for this specific class and project. So I'm looking into that right now. I think Brandon had a very good idea about just having a single point of entry for that.
Sorry, you can include like with everybody on
So that's part of the consideration.
I don't know if you can upload it.
Yeah, I'm not.
I'm in a group on Facebook and you can't upload.
Primarily for communication. So documents might be a little bit more of an issue.
Yeah, I mean, I would just create a group and find it. Because
Okay.
you have the file exchange thing and then discussion because our group has a separate group and
Okay. That's a great suggestion. I think bigger picture, the main emphasis is having a central location. So whether it's sort of with the Facebook or some other sort of large group where you can sort of build a wiki or anything else, I think it's certainly something that would be useful for the course as a whole. So something I'm working on getting together, and I think once I have it up and running, I'll definitely get back to you all. Okay? And then hopefully that should also help avoid being bombarded with lots of emails, which I know can be one, annoying, and two, onerous in terms of trying to track different emails that come through over time. Okay, any other questions about this stuff over here? Okay. So I trust that you all read chapters 2 and 3. My thoughts exactly.
Chapter 2 is a beast.
Yeah, it's fairly detailed, and I think part of the challenge is sort of sifting through what's important / relevant versus what's not. So my hope with putting together this set of slides was to help you sift through some of that. Because I was thinking I certainly have no expectation that you sort of the necessity to retain all of that information. But I want to point to a few things that will be important, especially as pertains to the project itself. Okay, because you're going to use some of these things. Part of our requirements. Some of the other things I'll emphasize less because even though they are discussed, they may not be directly related to what we're going to do.
Is it possible to put, I checked yesterday and I didn't see that PowerPoint on Whiteboard, friends.
Oh yeah, and that's partly my fault. I was putting finishing touches pretty late.
Okay, is it possible to get those before class so that
I
can make notes?
Sure,
on that
absolutely.
Instead of writing down everything.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. That's a lot of that sort of relies on how early I can get these slides together. We that it is a new textbook, but I'll try my best to get it in enough time for you all to at least print them out if you want to after class. Okay, so what I did basically was to combine and hit the key highlights for chapters 2 and 3. Okay, as pertains to this class. So just a quick overview for the things that are going to be relevant for this course, and you'll see that in some of the documentation I'll talk about later. Discussion of the system request, feasibility analysis, and then some traditional project management tools for outlining project timelines, key tasks, and things like that. So we're going to talk about some of those, and then we'll also talk about some of the requirements determination. aspects as well. Okay, so what did you all read about the system request? Anybody give me a sense of what the system request is, sort of general purpose of the system request?
It's a request for a new system that's sent to the admittance committee. Basically just tells who's involved, what it's going to be doing, what value it has to the system, or what value it has to the organization. All that kind of stuff.
Exactly right. Yeah.
Me?
Yes.
Oh, I was going to say the same thing.
Okay, yeah, so that's exactly right. So the idea is that there is some impetus for actually putting this system in place. Right, and so you want to have some way of actually identifying and documenting who, critical aspects of that, which is, one, who the key contact person is, the key sponsor for the project is. You want to have some sort of project champion and someone who's initially typically on the business side, the one who's also driving this need. And usually, this relates also to business value. Usually, the reason it tends to be more beneficial to have this be a business side sponsor is, one, that typically means it aligns with some important aspect of the business. Right, so if this is coming directly out of being initiated by the IT department, not to say that it has less value. There's certainly occasions where it has value, but the key thing is, particularly when you start looking at things like how much value is it adding, is that it's got to align with existing business strategies, so the way the organization is working, what its key goals are. And if it's something that's coming or initiated directly out of IT, it may or may not align with some of those needs. Whereas, typically, if it's coming out of a specific functional area, it has something to do with the way they operate that's ideally going to improve or add some value to how they do what they do. So there is value in having someone be on the business side of things initiating the project. All right, so basically, the main emphasis then is to make the business case for why the system is needed. All right, so you're going to outline what it's going to do, what the key requirements are for the capabilities themselves, and then outline how exactly it's going to translate into value. Typically, this will start as a high-level description. So if you look at the business need, for example, you might say increase sales as sort of a broad goal for the system. Well, when you get down to the level of the business value, you get a little bit more concrete. Like, okay, this is going to translate into 2% increase in sales, for example. Right, so you get a little bit more detail. Or if you're saying, you're going to decrease product defects as one of the overall goals, well, then when you get to the specifics of the business value, then you get into some of the details of just about how much. What's the defect rate going to be? You're going to decrease the defect rate by X%. Or we're going to realize this much in savings as a result of having fewer defects. So those are the key things. And then any sort of special constraints, associated with the system. For example, when Hershey implemented their ERP system, main stipulation is that it had to be completed ahead of Halloween that season. Of course, theirs was a complete debacle. Ended up having problems launching the ERP system. And because of the timing, it was right before Halloween. They had no way of actually managing their retail customer orders for the product. So, again, timing is everything. And so you have to be aware that this stuff doesn't necessarily happen within a bubble or within a vacuum. There's always some political and or just overall timing environment within which this occurs that actually constrains or affects the way the project progresses. So some awareness of how that actually works is important. So that actually translates into one of the requirements for your iteration 1 deliverables, which are located on Blackboard. So that's the reason I thought it would be useful at least to talk about it here in class as well. So you're going to have to produce a system request. And I think the there's a table on page 53 that actually provides a very useful outline of actually what those key things would be. Actually not that different from what you see here. Okay, so any questions on the system request? Okay, if not, then the next thing, just sort of, again, big picture, is to get into the feasibility analysis, right? So once you've actually described, the business value, you've described, who the key contact is going to be.
That's very interesting. I'm surprised it's not for that long. We know a lot before you get in.
This is, wow. Well, bear with me. Okay, so the feasibility analysis then has a couple of key elements, right? So this is sort of big picture. If you're selling this to the people who are going to be providing the resources and the funds to actually move this project forward, you have to make the case to them, right? So a couple of things that are essentially, one, reflective, and that's the technical feasibility, right? So actually determining whether we as an organization, or we as, in our case, folks actually developing the project, have the capabilities to build the system, or in our case, we're just essentially designing it, analyzing it, and providing initial design. But can we build it? And so there's certain, think of it almost as a form of risk analysis as well, right? So you want to assess how much risk is associated with this from a technical perspective. Right, so for example, what's the level of familiarity with the domain or the functional area? Right, it gets a little bit more risky once you start getting to areas that perhaps there's less familiarity with. Right, if you have less familiarity with the way the marketing function works, how to manage perhaps the sales function, for example, it becomes a lot riskier to develop a system to support that particular function if you're not familiar with how that operation works. So typically the way, the reason you do this is then you can begin to identify ways of actually overcoming some of those potential deficiencies. So for example, if you don't have a familiarity with the marketing area, it may make sense to have somebody from the marketing area on the team who has the domain knowledge to actually understand the various types of data that are processed, the roles and responsibilities and things like that, right? So that will feed into the requirements documentation as well. And typically, so approaches like agile development, for example. We talked about the agile variety of methodologies. The agile development methodology will typically require that there's a dedicated customer representative, right? So someone from the business side of things as a member of the team who is there to provide that kind of insight to the team. Another one is technology familiarity. Right, that goes without saying. That is, you want to be familiar with the infrastructure or the architecture that you're actually recommending or implementing. Right, so the more radical of a departure it is from what you actually know, the higher the risk, because you're not even sure how it's going to work in solving that particular problem. Okay, so some assessment of that risk, assessment and real reflection on the capability of the team to actually do some of these things is important from the start. The next is the economic feasibility. So should we build it, right? So it involves some assessment of the financial case for this. Right, so you want to assess your development costs. Typically that's viewed as being the one-time costs, right? So it's the time they're actually developing the project. So you want to focus on such things as, if you're employing a consulting team, what are the billable hours for that duration of the project? What's the cost of the infrastructure if you're going to be investing in a database, for example, if you're going to be investing in various case tools, whatever else you need to build the system, servers, for the system. Those are typically sort of the one-time costs. But in addition, you have these operating costs, right? These are the much longer-term things. Like how long is it going to, how much is it going to cost to maintain this? Or if it's a hosted service, what are the costs, monthly costs for actually paying? The client is going to have to pay monthly for actually maintaining their account. Then you also want to document what some of the benefits are monetarily. Be it, how much they're going to see realize in savings or increased revenues. And so all this will culminate as you do a cost-benefit analysis and actually seeing, to project out over the long term, what the break-even point is. At what point do you actually get the system actually paying for itself to outweigh, or meet the costs, and then project out after that what the overall benefits are going to be for the project. Right. So I think in the text they do a very good job of outlining some of the approaches, to calculating present value, net present value, things like that. So you want to make sure that in making the case, hard numbers usually are a big thing for somebody. For the folks typically on this committee who are not going to be technically savvy, they know the numbers, right? They're going to be investing in this, and so you want to make the case to them that there is some actual financial return for them if they actually invest in this. So this economic feasibility is absolutely important. Okay? And then finally is this organizational feasibility, right? So once you put this thing in place, is it going to get used? You're trying to convince the committee to give you the green light on this project to go ahead and provide the funding for it. They want to be sure that it actually gets will be used once it's implemented. The last thing they want is to pour all this money into the system and then find that users are trying to find workarounds around the system, or it's just simply not getting used. Because ultimately they're not going to see the ROI, just a return on investment if it's not being used. Okay, so it usually helps if you have some project champion, right, who emphasizes to employees at all levels of the organizational hierarchy that the organization and certainly the management is behind this. They back this particular project. It means that typically the users, the folks who are the line managers and lower level employees, frontline employees, actually buy into and are supportive of the system, rather than sabotaging or trying to work around the system. Okay, so making sure that you have this top management support usually will then ensure that folks at the lower levels of the organizational hierarchy also are on board. Which also means that it affects the accuracy of the information that you're getting from them, because it's going to impact how they actually work as well. So if you're telling a bank teller, for example, that the way they process customer accounts is going to change, and they've been doing well as far as how they've been managing that task so far, it's going to impact their performance probably in the short run, right, as they figure out this new system. Well, you want to make sure that you get their buy-in and emphasize to them that there is value added to them using this new system. So making sure you have this project champion is one way of ensuring that. The other one is obviously having some level of user involvement. They have to feel like they have some stake in actually providing input into how that system is going to work. Okay? And then the strategic alignment, right? Ultimately, it's got to align with some fundamental business objective if it's going to see any actual use. Okay, so are there any questions on this? Any questions about what you read about technical, economic, organizational feasibility?
Do we have to do a cost-benefit analysis for our project?
In this case, yeah, you will. But because this is a non-profit type of situation, obviously the parameters are going to be somewhat different. So there may not be specific. There may or may not be specific financial things like performance-based outcomes, but you might look at it in terms of things like data accuracy, data security, the variety of other outcomes you might actually look at. And you'll typically link those back to the requirements that you're looking at as well. So yeah, it's an excellent question.
I was going to ask you, in the system request, in our business value, it would be, because it's hard to, because we don't know how many hours they already put into managing their system, you know what I'm saying? So it's hard to say, we're going to cut 15 hours out of their weekly, system maintenance, but, you know what I'm saying? Because we don't know how many hours they're going to, I guess that's what you're asking.
Well, and that's part of this
Yeah.
process of gathering requirements, right? So through actually engaging with Jan or wherever else, you might find that kind of effort. So it'll be a great question to ask is, currently, how much time are you spending actually managing this? Between throwing this in and then sending an email to somebody else with the spreadsheet attached, waiting for them to fill it in. How long does it take to go through this full, cycle of all volunteers currently? And then you might project out, well, if they all just one central system, you cut down that time by whatever X amount of. Obviously, I think one of the things that's emphasized in this particular chapter is that this is an iterative process. So what that means is you may come up with an initial estimate. Like, okay, we're going to cut it down by 40%. As you go through and sort of have more accurate information, then your assessments of what that improvement might be, then generally sort of be updated. So it's an iterative process, but that's an excellent question that you want to know the answer to at some point. Right. So as you can see, a lot of what they talk about is mostly in the for-profit type of sector, but you have to sort of rethink what the business value or the value is for a non-profit type of establishment as well. And so it requires you to think a little bit differently about this whole process. It's certainly something that you'll want to do in your back and forth with Jan as you go through this process. Other questions about this? Okay, so some other things that are going to be quite relevant and useful for you. One is this, obviously as you're breaking down how this project is going to look. Overall, you want to have a plan for how you're going to execute various phases of this project. It breaks this down into the component tasks. So with that, then, a couple of elements here that they recommend. One is this work breakdown structure. Right, so basically just a hierarchical listing of each of the tasks. Okay, whatever, 1 through 50. These 50 things need to get done. Need to get done in this order. Here's how long each one is going to take. One might take, just a few hours. Another one might take, a day or two. So to figure out what those are, and then the dependencies. Right. Step 5 cannot happen until step 2 has been completed. Right, so step 2 then stands in the critical path of step 5 being completed. You want to know what those dependencies are and how they're interrelated. And then something that enumerates the status of the project. What's currently completed, what has yet to be done, what's in process. Obviously, this is an evolving thing, right? So each iteration you're going to update that information, right? So, for example, if you had the tasks outlined today, obviously much of the stuff, with the exception of coming up with the team charter, would be to be done or in progress. But over the course of the next few weeks, then as you update that information, some things would be completed, whereas other things would be in process. So the work breakdown structure is one way of actually just listing out and outlining what those key tasks are. And this doesn't really get down to the level of detail of the project content in the sense that, we're not going back to the specific requirements that were listed earlier. Right, it's more so along the lines of just the overall management of the project. Okay, so, when we're going through this first iteration, coming up with a system request is a task that you'll need to do. Coming up with the team charter was one of the tasks and that's necessary. Doing the feasibility analysis, economic task, organizational is another task that you have to do. Right, so those are not domain specific as far as specific client. It has to do with the overall project. Does that make sense? So that's one way. The other way is a Gantt chart, which essentially enumerates much of the same information, but in a much more visual way. Right. So a very good way, illustration of that. In chapter 2 would be a page. Page 72. I think typically with Visio or with Microsoft Project, you should be able to do this. Right? It just sort of illustrates what the key tasks are. Each one has a task ID. You enumerate how long you expect it to take, when you expect to start. And then within each one, you actually outline at the top the timeline and who's responsible for that specific task. So that's something you're going to want to go through as a group in defining what needs to be done and who's going to do what by when. And what I suggest with this, we'll see this later on, is to break this down by iteration. Right, so each iteration has been broken down. You have certain sort of deliverables that have been nicely broken down to you for the first iteration, and so you can build that into your timeline. To break this out, say, well, the feasibility analysis is going to be done by whoever, X, Y, and Z, according to this timeline, and so on and so forth. So that will require some discussion on your part as a group as to who's responsible for what within that iteration. And so you can outline a Gantt chart or work breakdown structure for each iteration. Right, so when you look at iteration 2 and the deliverables for that, you can outline the core tasks or visual representation of that for that iteration as well. And it's a lot easier to read as compared to if you try to just do a single Gantt chart, for example, for the entire project. I think it's a lot easier if you just break it down to each iteration. It'll be a lot more manageable. And the last one is this network diagram, which basically outlines each task and then shows visually how each one is linked to each other, so you can identify critical paths for each of the tasks. Right, so you can see whether or not there are potential bottlenecks in the project, such that if one particular task basically determines whether or not the project is finished, then obviously the completion of that task will determine whether or not you finish that deliverable. So you might think about how you prioritize that particular task, for example. You're not going to know that unless you either outline what the dependencies are or take a look at what that critical task might be. So all things that are important for what you're going to be doing. So it's, what I'd suggest for this, as soon as you can, is to think about which one of these you want to. I think for this, actually one of the requirements for this is to have a Gantt chart. So you're going to, by default, need to go with this particular approach here, which is outlining each one of these. So you want to engage in some discussion of who's going to be doing each of these things. Okay? And you can do that based on what you have here for this iteration 1 set of deliverables. So I've just shown you here basically how you might embed each one of these, and you can do the same with the Gantt charts. Basically, looking at different phases of the project, but within that, if you combine it with this unified process, which is what we're doing in this class, where we're focused on the inception and the elaboration phase, how you can sort of break that out. Right, so with this stage, for the most part, a lot of what we're going to do is basically the inception. Right, that's already listed in the deliverables for iteration 1 and 2. So take an example here of the business modeling stage. To break this out a little bit more detail, the inception phase might include things like understanding what the current business processes are. How do they currently do the volunteer work hour information? How do they capture that information from volunteers? What are the current roles? An intern versus a volunteer versus perhaps an executive committee member. How's that information tracked? So just understanding what the current process is, and then doing some analysis to identify what, if any, potential problems there are in the existing business process. You might identify additional steps that sort of depends on the nature of the problem might say, well, looking at this requirements phase, then within the inception phase, key things we want to do are to identify what specific requirements analysis technique you're going to use. There are three different ones that you can look at. What gathering technique you're going to use. I think, again, there are a number that are listed here. The use of interviews or JAD, so the Joint Application Development Approach. Observation, so you might shadow, are you going to shadow somebody who actually executes many of these processes to observe how they actually do so? So figuring out what type of technique you're going to use, then identifying key requirements. So what I suggest you do, take the next 10 to 15 minutes, is to begin to discuss some of these elements of the system request. If you don't have your textbooks, you can always go back to the slide, but engage in some discussion of some of those elements here. And then obviously you can elaborate a little bit more offline once you've had some basic discussion. And then having some discussion of what you think are some, at least at a high level, the technical, economic, and organizational feasibility issues of the project.
System request, you just go through these 5 things? Yeah. We're just basically going over the system request. So going through each of these. So the project sponsor is Jan and Jan and June.
Okay, folks. I hate to interrupt you, but hopefully you've gotten off to some at least initial discussion that will be helpful so that when you go offline and continue to discuss some of these elements. That will be important. You will hopefully also start getting on the path to putting some of these things together. You find that as you put these things together, ahead of time, hopefully it also prevents a mad rush towards the end. So certainly helps to get this discussion going on early. Okay, so the other aspect of this that's important and that's particularly relevant for this project is this issue of requirements determination. Overall, for the project and the ultimate success of the project, this is perhaps one of the most important stages or phases of the project, is determining what exactly the system is supposed to do. To determine whether or not this project as a whole is ultimately a success in terms of whether it gets used, is actually able to execute the right processes, get the right data, processes the correct way. So, several types of requirements that are discussed in this chapter. It's the business requirement, right? So there's typically a separation, although in practice you don't see it as much. These tend to be a lot more blended together, or tend to merge a lot more. But there's typically a distinction between business requirements and system requirements. So business requirements, just think of those as what, on the business side of things, the functional area side of things, they need the system to be able to do. Right, so, need to be able to input and store volunteer hours, for example. Right, so that's a business requirement. That's something that on the business side they need to be able to do. System requirement typically then is a lot more oriented towards the actual technology that you're putting in place. And what it needs to be able to do, like take the volunteer hours and store it in a database somewhere. Provide online access to that information as a system requirement, right? So that's, in a way, it's separate from the actual functional requirements from the business side of things. It's just what happens as far as the technology is concerned. But as the text, this chapter talks about, typically these things tend to be, at least the lines that separate these things tend to be fairly blurred in practice. The more important distinction is this distinction between functional and non-functional requirements. Does anybody recall what was mentioned as far as the distinction between these two? What are functional requirements, do you think? Function.
Like things that it has to do.
Right, so things that it has to do with respect to what you sort of have.
Yeah.
Right, so with respect to the business requirements, right? So these functional requirements, think of them almost as things that the system itself should do. That's distinct from these non-functional requirements, right? So things like what we just talked about, input, enable the user to input volunteer hours, functional requirement. Enable customers to place purchase orders. These are functional requirements, right? So it's an actual business activity that needs to be executed. That's in contrast to non-functional requirements. What's a non-functional requirement?
It's like behavioral properties like performance of the system, like uptime, things like that.
Exactly, right? So this will pertain to things like how long should it take for the system to extract information from the database? Or what's the overall uptime for the system? Or, in the case of this project, the user should be able to access this using any browser. That doesn't really have as much to do with the business side functions, but it is an important requirement as far as enabling the system, right? So if they want to be able to access it through Google Chrome, or through IE, or through Firefox, it's a non-functional requirement. It's no less important. It's just that it doesn't directly relate to a business function. Okay? So these two, there are important considerations associated with each of these. So you want to make sure that you actually outline what those requirements are. This is, as I mentioned before, perhaps one of the most important stages or phases of the project is actually doing this determinist requirements determination. So just listed some examples that come directly from the text for examples of non-functional requirements versus functional requirements. So you see a lot of these basically are actual business side activities, making appointments, changing appointments, canceling an appointment, checking the daily schedule. Whereas these non-functional ones have to do with things like responsibilities, right? So, in terms of accessibility, the security requirements, only doctors can set their availability, for example. In our project, it might be that only system administrators can update and or change or schedule events on the calendar. That might be a non-functional requirement as far as which roles are allowed to do which things. Okay, so then you want to think about this in the context of this project. Which of those priorities that were listed are the functional requirements versus which ones are the non-functional requirements? And some of those may need to be broken down a little bit more. They discuss these, many of these things at basically a fairly broad level, but you'll see as you go with the back and forth with Jan that perhaps there's a lot more detail there than initially meets the eye. Right, so that first bullet point that has to do with the tracking the volunteer hours seems like a fairly easy thing. It's like, well, why do we need an entire semester just to embed that one functionality? But there's a lot more there if you start to unpack that particular process. as to what the different roles are, who gets to do what when, how long after an event do people get to log their hours. Do you want to do it monthly? Once that time has passed and you have a volunteer who has put in hours but hasn't put it into the system, what's the process for going back then after the fact and updating that information? Who gets to do? Those are things you want to find out about, because there's a lot more in there than is just suggested simply by saying we wanted to have this volunteer hours record online. There's a lot more involved in that process. So you want to unpack some of that and break it down into specific requirements, or specific functional requirements and/or non-functional requirements. Because the more detail you can get, the more you can sort of say, well, okay, you can check each box. Yeah, we've done this, we've done this, we've done this, we've done this. And so you're meeting more directly the user's needs. So the variety of approaches to doing this. I won't talk about these for too long, but they vary in the level of radical change or the level of change that's involved. So this business process automation is the lowest amount of change. Think of it as almost automating through technology things that are currently done. So you're not really changing much of the way the process is done, but simply using technology to perhaps do it better or more efficiently. Okay. So we've outlined a few techniques for that. Problem analysis, where you identify what the problems are, and then identify solutions through technology to address those problems. Business process improvement is a little bit more of a radical departure in terms of change in process, in the sense that you take an existing process and identify ways you can actually change the process to make it better. So a variety of techniques is duration analysis, so figuring out how long it takes to do each step in the business process. I think airlines, Delta, I believe it was Delta, there was a report that just came out at the end of 2011 that ranked all the airlines. I don't know if you all have seen this. It ranked each of the airlines in terms of their performance as far as delays, customer complaints, rebooking, having to rebook on flights because of overbooking. And so they looked at some of the changes in how these airlines have performed. And I think Delta, which used to have an atrocious record, particularly for lost baggage, in addition to delays, I think they were notorious for delays, has actually shot up in the listing. So one of the things they did was this duration analysis. They basically went and followed the process for each flight, everything from how long it took the airline crew to get on the plane, and the time it took from the first set of passengers to board the plane to the last set of passengers to board, how long after that it actually took to get off the gate, how long after actually arriving at the gate it took to have the doors open, how long it took to actually get the baggage from the plane onto the baggage carousel. It actually tracked the time and then focused on reducing each of those timelines. And that vastly, they found, actually improved the ranking on all of these things. So this is a way of actually breaking some of these processes down a lot more effectively to actually see how you can actually improve the processes. ABC, or this activity-based processing, is another way, right? You just look at each activity and then estimate how much it actually costs to perform that function, that activity. So very simple things as, in terms of the materials used, what's the cost of the materials used, if you're thinking about a production process, for example. For those of you who are accountants, then you obviously want to account for things like facility rent, right? Because the rent for that facility, what's that product is being produced or that activity is being performed on, obviously on a per unit basis also has to be accounted for. Depreciation is something you want to account for as well in that process. So this activity-based costing is another very useful one. And then informal benchmarking, typically against industry standards or high industry leaders for that particular process. Looking at things like best practices to try to find ways to enhance performance. And this is typically the most radical and also the most risky, which is this BPR, or business process reengineering. Right, so there you're just fundamentally changing the way things get done. Be it, from an outcome analysis perspective, you say, well, we use the customer service contact point as the primary emphasis, and we're going to redesign everything that we do around that in terms of getting our service to the user a lot quicker, making sure there, a lot fewer things fall through the cracks when providing customer service. You just essentially outline what those things are and then redesign the entire process with that outcome in mind. So I'll leave this for you all to do offline in your groups and maybe build in some time at the beginning of class on Wednesday to discuss some of these functional, particularly the functional and non-functional requirements as pertain to this particular project. So I'll build in some time then. So just a few things before I let you go. For ahead of Wednesday, one is that I'll give you Jan's contact information so that you can begin to initiate contact with her. If you have any questions about specific requirements or anything else, you can contact her directly. Okay? So that's one. Two, for those of you who are not currently taking Professor Guan's database class, on Wednesday at 1 p.m., if you can spare maybe half an hour, he has a few folks coming here from Kazan to talk about SharePoint and the use of SharePoint that essentially ties everything together that you, as you've gone through the major mail, have been using. And it's a very useful tool because it's something that you're likely to see in collaboration in practice anyway. So I'd encourage you, if you can make the time, to go to the session. It's actually going to be here in this room at 1 p.m.
I saw an email from another one of my professors about it said they needed actually quite a bit of SharePoint experience. Is that, do you know anything? Would you say that's true, or was that just more like a thing they wanted?
I think it was more of a bullet point thing for some of the camps, especially if they're doing the camp. I think they have some recap or something that they do with SharePoint. But I think this one is specifically much more of an informational thing. They have some recent graduates of this program who have gone on to actually use SharePoint in practice. So it will be a lot more beneficial. You don't necessarily have to have prior experience with it.
Okay, but for instance, over that real camp that you would use.
Yeah, I think that one. Yeah, I think they have some specific things. So definitely look into it if you're interested.
I'll type this up and put it on Dropbox today.
Cool.
Yeah, that or whatever.